I was actually hired by a gentleman named Mark Wozniak, who at the time was working as a consultant for Sony Corporation and developing a concept which at that time had no name. We had a secret code name for it called PSX. Sony had achieved a relationship with a company called Nintendo, who we all know well. Nintendo was wanting to add a CD-ROM feature to the existing Nintendo platform, and that was essentially going to be called the Super Nintendo. At the very last minute, when Sony and Nintendo were about to announce the relationship, Nintendo essentially pulled out of the deal. Ken Kutaragi, who was the Oracle, as we all called him, the man who really spurred on the vision of PlayStation, invented it from the ground up. He was very upset when Nintendo pulled out of the original deal. Ken did, put his hand on the table and emphatically declare in Japanese that we were going to, essentially bury Nintendo. And Sony, having already spent a lot of time and a great deal of money and effort to build this CD-ROM attachment to the Nintendo, decided to take what it had learned and develop the PlayStation. Nobody really understood at the time, I think, the significance of the kind of state change between 2D video games and 3D video games. And the Sony PlayStation was built around 3D gaming. We were challenged to kind of create this new form of content, which was completely 3D. Not that I could predict the future, but I really felt like, Sony had the wherewithal to pull it off. The development cycle was very, very quick. From initial concept to product delivery was about 6 months for the PlayStation as an architecture. And that was at the time pretty revolutionary. Very much just-in-time engineering. I had seen at that time a prototype of the PlayStation, which was about as big as a Xerox machine. And it looked a little bit like a Xerox machine. People finally believed that it was possible to do these kinds of graphics and have that kind of audio quality on a platform, this small. Before then, before we had this physical unit, people were always asking, well, yeah, okay, so you can do it in a box this big, but can you do it in a box this big? And when we finally had that box to show and showed the same demonstration software, people were sold. Because of 3DO's lack of success, we had to overcome the fact that, oh, you're just another 3DO, or you're just like all the systems that had come before that had failed. What does Sony know about video gaming? Now today that seems completely ridiculous. When we were trying to sell it as a product to publishers, to game developers, it was very difficult for us to overcome the success of Sega, the success of Nintendo. We had to really do a lot to convince developers that we were different in some way. If we could convince those people that our platform was the best platform to work on, that we really did have a good idea about how games would behave in the future, and that 3D was the way to go, then those same developers would not be creating games for Sega, would not be creating games for Nintendo. And that was really the strategy that succeeded. When the PlayStation came out, Steve Race was designated as the keynote speaker for that year's very first E3. Everybody was really prepared and anxious to listen in and see what Steve would have to say to kind of kick off the first E3 and to understand more about the PlayStation and what it was going to do in the American market. And Steve came out very, famously and had some papers and put them down on the podium, and in one moment that I'll never forget, he shouted out to the audience, $2.99, and then left his papers on the podium and walked off the stage. It was a challenge for Sony to meet that price point. Nobody had ever quite done it that way before, selling the base unit, the platform at a loss, hoping to recoup. And I say hoping to recoup all of the expense and the R&D for developing a piece of hardware by the third-party licensing fees that are charged to publishing companies. That was a completely new business model. Steve and ultimately Ken Kutaragi and Terry Toganaka took a huge risk in allowing the price point to be at that level. Hindsight's 20/20, so I think they made a good bet.
So I first encountered the PlayStation, like the E3 before it came out. And this was the show where it was like the Saturn's big debut. It was supposed to be the Saturn's time in the sun. They were like, the Saturn's out now, go get one. At E3, there's always these booths off to the side. And it's like a guy selling controllers. And the guy was selling controllers that were compatible with the PlayStation. And he had a Japanese PlayStation there set up. And he had Toshinden. So this was like the first time you really saw a lot of this stuff. And there was a crowd of people that just spent most of the show right there playing Toshinden. And I was there most of the time just playing that. And right then and there, you kind of knew that the PlayStation was going to kick the shit out of the Saturn.
I think like that system wowed me more than just about any other system in history.
It wasn't a hugely impressive launch lineup, but some of the games really stood out. November came around, a lot of big games came out. Destruction Derby was really hyped, Twisted Metal, the first Tekken. November was kind of a big month for the PlayStation.
When the original PlayStation came out, I wasn't a huge gamer. I had been a huge gamer previously, but I was quite happy just playing my Super Nintendo. When I went to university, I didn't have the money to buy a lot of games and everything, so it didn't even cross my mind to buy a PlayStation. I went around to a friend's house, and another friend was there with a PlayStation, and they were playing Tekken. I think was the only game they had, and I just flipped out as soon as I saw it.
Tekken was totally like the fighting series that kind of defined the PlayStation experience.
The Tekken games are my favorite fighting games by far. I generally don't play fighting games. Tekken 3 is probably my favorite one, not just because the fighting was probably as good as it's ever been, but because I had the Tekken Ball mode. I actually played that more than I did one-on-one fights, I think.
Tekken wasn't available right at launch, but it was kind of on the back of the box, and you knew right then and there, Tekken's coming. So it's like, just suffer through Battle Arena Toshinden, play some Street Fighter the movie, wait through the load times on Mortal Kombat 3 or whatever, but Tekken's coming soon.
Battle Arena Toshinden. Now that was a fighting game. Let me tell you something.
I played the Japanese version before to come out in the US, and it seemed awesome. Like, it was just like, oh, these moves are all crazy, these characters are really neat. And it came out in the US, and I didn't realize it at the time, but they had changed all the voices and done a lot of really weird stuff to it. But for me, for some reason on the US version, I just couldn't do any special moves.
You know, in retrospect, probably wasn't a very good fighting game, but it was the only fighting game that I had played in 3D other than Virtua Fighter, and I owned this one, so it was awesome.
I don't know what they had done to the controller or whatever. I think part of it was just me not being used to the D-pad on the PlayStation because it was so different than the Super Nintendo or even the Saturn. And part of it was just, you know, maybe the controller being new and not broken in, but it, like, to just do a fireball on that controller seemed impossible at the time. Then like a better fighting game came out later, and I realized, oh, it's just this game was programmed by idiots.
One of the games that everyone made a big deal about on the PlayStation was Final Fantasy VII.
I pray at the altar of Final Fantasy VII, and I am one of those people.
You know, just the opening sequence was great. You know, as soon as you start playing it, you know it's a Final Fantasy game.
So we get to 7 and we start playing it, and I realized, hey, this game's kind of different. And I wasn't sure if I really liked it or not.
I played that game through 3 times in a row, like when I first got it.
Final Fantasy VII is pretty much the definitive RPG. I mean, people still play that game today, and they still, you know, create fan fiction or get into cosplay stuff, and it's just crazy what that game started.
I was never a really big RPG player. To me, this was like the greatest thing, and it really sort of got me into them, and I play them definitely a lot more now than I would have without it. Looking back on it now, I almost don't want to ever play it again, just because you look at the screenshots of the game now and you're like, their hands end in cubes and they have no face and they really look really bizarre compared to the graphics of today. But at the time, you looked at, you know, stuff like Limit Breaks and you were like, oh my god, that looks so amazing! Omnislash, yay!
Those Final Fantasy games. I played about halfway through 7. I got to like the snowboarding part, and I was like, you know what? I don't think I want to play Final Fantasy 7 anymore.
The best Final Fantasy is Final Fantasy 8. I don't care what anyone says.
Why does everybody hate Final Fantasy 8 so much? I mean, the gameplay is a little flawed, sure. I mean, they could have thought out some of the gameplay concepts better, but the story is probably the best story in the entire series.
had a great story, great storyline, great characters.
I was a sucker for Squall. Loved that little furry jacket he had. Now, I didn't wear one, but I would look good in one. I really would.
And a lot of people didn't like Squall at all because he was so laconic, but if you got into the storyline, it was definitely one of the best.
Final Fantasy VIII was better than Final Fantasy VII, and here's why. Way more fandom, way more fandom. Stories with Squall and Cypher doing all sorts of crazy things that you can't even imagine, but I encourage you to research it.
You know what made me cry about Final Fantasy VIII? The fact that you couldn't turn off the summon animations. Remember that? It would take like 45 seconds every time you summon Shiva. I hated that.
Stretches across all 4 discs, constantly giving you new information, but never enough to really tie everything together. Like, you actually don't get the entire story until you're watching the ending sequence of the game.
Super Puzzle Fighter 2 Turbo, I remember kind of fondly because it was really popular in the office that I worked at when it came out. But I also remember it being really frustrating for me because I'm colorblind and the yellow and the green squares look identical in that game to me. So that was a really hard game for me to play against the guys in the office.
There were a lot of really bad games on the PlayStation. I think one of the ones that sticks out in my mind is a game called Circuit Breakers.
I love this game.
Okay, remember the Micro Machines games, how they were all really bad?
It was the only game I ever used the multi-tap with. And it was one of those little racers where the person in the front would move the screen.
And it was terrible. So like, curves would just sneak up on you. You were constantly falling off the track, doing all this stupid stuff. So Circuit Breakers was not only just like a total rip-off of these games, but it was a rip-off of games that weren't very good to begin with.
And I just want to say that Circuit Breakers was one of my favorite games on the PlayStation 1.
Circuit Breakers is garbage.
Cool Borders 2. That's one of my favorite games ever. One of my favorite things about it was the pro trick competition. And I wanted to get like the highest score I could possibly get so that people could never say they'd beaten me. So I was playing this marathon session of Cool Borders 2, and I remember the 711th trick, my hands cramped up and like sort of spasmed, and the controller fell out of my hands onto the ground. And I was like, well, I guess that's my high score.
I think if I had to pick just one PlayStation game as my all-time favorite, I would be inclined to say Final Fantasy Tactics, which is a game that I just often feel the urge to just go back and play, and I don't feel that way about any other PlayStation game, really.
It really changed a lot. I mean, it had the Final Fantasy name, but it was really a lot different than any other Final Fantasy game before.
It says Final Fantasy in front of it, but it doesn't really look like Final Fantasy on the back.
And what they did was they took what was kind of tedious about the Final Fantasy games, which is the random battles, and they actually made it fun, and they made it more strategic.
It ended up being this incredibly great game. I even have a soft spot for the horrible localization that went on in some parts of that game.
I really love that game. I had a lot of fun with that game. Probably of any PlayStation game, that's probably the game that I spent the most number of hours on.
Oddworld Abe's Odyssey is probably, I think, the most beautiful game ever to be released for the PlayStation.
Oddworld was a really unique game. It was kind of a side-scrolling, sort of a platformer, but there was also a lot of puzzle solving involved. The coolest thing about Oddworld was just this whole world that they created.
I remember it really fondly because at the time I was editor of PlayStation Solutions magazine, and I wrote a complete solution to it over 3 or 4 issues where I screenshotted the entire game, like every single screen. And Oddworld was so impressed with it that they actually sent me a Harrods hamper over in the UK.
Symphony of the Night, probably the best 2D side-scroller ever.
It played kind of like a Super Metroid where you're just going around and you'd get these cool power-ups and stuff, and it was really a lot of fun.
Still has yet to be unseated in my mind. It was cool for a number of reasons. You got to play Alucard, who was an awesome anti-hero instead of the sissy Belmonts with their little dominatrix whips.
It really filled that need for kind of an old school type of game, and it was really cool.
Sick music, such that I imported the OST separate from the game.
Vib Ribbon, I just have to mention because all the guys at GameSpot US, I remember them hounding me for copies of that game when I joined the staff, because it was never released over here. It was released in Japan and it was released in Europe. And what was great about it is that even though its graphics were kind of crappy and they looked like they were 10 years old, even when the game came out, I think it was probably the first game that let you put in any music CD of your choice and then created levels based on that. There are other games coming out now, some of which aren't announced yet, that are going to do that.
Bushido Blade was a 3D fighting game that was really unlike any other 3D fighting game up until that point.
Bushido Blade 2 is not as good as Bushido Blade 1, but it was an alright game.
And you could just basically hack each other their bits. You could cut some guy's leg off, cut some guy's arm off, or just, you know, run him through.
Bushido Blade kicks ass, and Bushido Blade 2 sucked.
Some of my best gaming memories are associated with Twisted Metal. Like the time my buddy came over and we downed, I don't even know how much Jolt. Just a lot of Jolt, a whole lot of Jolt. And we stayed up for like, I think it was around 48 hours playing that game. And we just took that game apart.
One unique thing about the PlayStation for me was importing games. I had never imported games really before the PlayStation came out. And there were a lot of crazy Japanese 2D fighters that came out over there, but would never come out over here. The most impressive one was this one called Asuka 120% Special Burning Fest. And it was just this crazy, I don't know, insane game.
Asuka 120% Special Burning Fest!
I remember sitting down with Jeff Gerstmann one time and we were just trying to hash out the most insane combos we could, because like once you got your power meter up to 120%, that's the thing, is you could just start busting out repeated special moves in a row, the super specials, and you could kind of chain crazy combos. I don't know, there weren't a whole lot of games like that at the time, so it was pretty cool to be able to play that.
I love this. I actually really like this game. This game is a really bad fighting game, but I played a whole lot of it. So Tobal #1 came out in the US, and it was like this 3D fighting game that Square did that most people only remember because it came with a demo of Final Fantasy VII. But anyway, Tobal was a really cool game that had some really neat ideas, but didn't really go all the way with it. Tobal 2 was awesome. And since Tobal #1 did so poorly in the US, they never brought Tobal 2 over. But Tobal 2 was like, you know, it was probably like one of the first 60 frame per second fighting games that were out there. It was really smooth. It had a lot of really neat control ideas. It was just really unique for a 3D fighting game. You know, this is the era of games like Tekken and Virtua Fighter where they had very standard 3D fighter control schemes already dreamed up. And the Tobal series just kind of threw all that away and said, no, we're going with high, medium, and low. And you can, you know, basically you have 8-way run. And this was, you know, back before games really did the whole 8-way run thing all the time. It was really unique in its time, and it just looked awesome. That game still is, it looks great.
Motor Team Grand Prix 2 isn't a great game. It's just a kind of cartoony racing game. It was the first game I ever got a promo copy of, I think, when I started work on magazines, so that was a really big deal. It was by Polyphony Digital, who obviously now are best known for Gran Turismo, and this is kind of where they started out.
The PlayStation had a lot of big franchises launch with it. Resident Evil, Tomb Raider, Metal Gear Solid, all these big games that we're still playing sequels of today pretty much started with the PlayStation.
Resident Evil is amazing.
What? What is this?
Crazy horror zombie game, and then every once in a while I'd actually like get it in my head that, hey, maybe I should play this, and then I would try playing it and then realize, wait a minute, I hate this.
Jill, here's a lockpick. It might be handy if you, the master of unlocking, take it with you.
What I remember about Resident Evil was, at the time I was rooming with this guy. He was this big punk rock guy with a mohawk. And so these three like sort of tough guys came over and I popped in Resident Evil. And I was playing and they were watching me and they were all kind of like, oh, this game looks cool or whatever. And I get to the part with the dogs. And I swear to you, all three of them, two tough guys, scream like little girls. They were all like, ah! And I just, you know, it's just one of the greatest memories I have. One of the games I was looking forward to most on the PlayStation was Tomb Raider 2.
I hate Tomb Raider so much. From the get-go.
When it came out, I was in college and I was very, very poor. So I actually couldn't afford to buy the game, but I could rent it.
The gameplay at the time was just like, oh, this is Prince of Persia, but with a girl and guns, and why am I shooting all these tigers?
I rented it, I took it home, I did not leave the television set. I played for 23 and a half hours.
Anyone who likes them is some kind of moron or something, I don't know. People, only the truly insane would vouch for Lara Croft in this day and age.
I happened to mention to the guy at Blockbuster or whatever that I had beaten it, and he said, "There's no way, you rented it like 2 days ago, there's just no way. You know, a day and a half ago, I don't understand." And I said, no, I really did, I beat it, I swear. So he made me go back to my house, get my memory card, and I brought it into the store, and he popped in one of the PlayStations, and he sort of saw that I had beaten it, and he gave me free rentals for a month.
Metal Gear Solid was cool because it let you break necks, and no game ever let you break necks before.
It was a game that was greater than the sum of its parts, and if you deconstruct the parts, it does kind of break down.
You know, I was excited about that game because, you know, I was like, oh, I love Metal Gear and the NES, you know, this is going to be great. And then when I realized it was like, you know, 9 hours of movie for 2 minutes of gameplay, like, that, I was kind of done with that after.
But if you just go, dude, that guy totally made me unplug my controller, it's awesome.
What happened? Snake!
With the PlayStation, they had that whole "you are not ready" thing going, and the date itself was like a big event.
You know, you look on the box and it kind of takes you a second to figure it out because it's spelled like "you are not," and then the E is red, so you're like, "You are not E, what does that mean?" And then, you know, you figure it out and you're like, well, okay. I just wasn't buying it at first, and you know, because I was a Nintendo and Sega fanboy, and you know, here comes these new guys, it's like, you know, why should I care about them? But it came around eventually.
And that was one of the things that sort of made it stand out for me as one of the first big console launches.
Almost from day one, Sony Europe marketed the PlayStation to be a kind of hip lifestyle accessory. I used to go into nightclubs and see PlayStation pods in there. And then there was, I think the first big controversial thing, certainly that I remember, was I think at one of the big music festivals, possibly Glastonbury, they gave out postcards with, it was like a picture of some guy's face and a PlayStation logo. And the postcards were pre-perforated into tiny little rectangles so that you could break them off, roll them up, and use them as roaches when you were smoking things you shouldn't be. There was another really good one they did where they had some kind of mailing list, and they just did this mail shot of envelopes that were labeled test results, and inside were all these fake x-rays and like a doctor's letter and that kind of thing. And the deal was that it was supposed to be like, oh, you know, they found something horribly wrong with you, and the only way you can sort it out is to get yourself a PlayStation. And they got in a lot of trouble for that because I guess a bunch of the people who received those were actually waiting for test results from hospitals and that kind of thing.
And I was the first kind of employee of Sony Computer Entertainment America, and it was really a fun time. It was quite an ambitious plan. I initially had an office that was just kind of a few doors down from Tommy Mottola, and I had no idea who he was at the time. Mr. Mottola brought me into his office one day, and he sat me down and he said, "You know, Todd, I want you to know I have a daughter now, and I really love her quite a lot. And I want to make sure that the games that come out on the PlayStation are not violent and have, you know, nothing lewd or objectionable in them. And it's up to you guys to figure out, you know, how to set those standards." And I was, you know, thinking about rock and roll and thinking about kind of the environment that he lives in, sex, drugs, rock and roll. That's his world, and yet he was giving me a mandate, really, to make sure that none of that happened in the video game industry. And I had no control over it, but it was fun to kind of be there to listen to him and say, yeah, we'll do our best.
I got my first PlayStation by trading 30 Genesis games in for one. It seemed like a pretty good deal at the time because I wasn't working at the time, so I was between a couple of jobs. So I was like, well, hey, you know, if I can just turn these games that I'm not playing into a PlayStation, that's great. But now I totally wish I had all those Genesis games back.
I imported my PlayStation from Japan right around the time when it came out in Japan. I wire transferred like $900 and change to some guy in Japan that I didn't know who was going to give me a deal, and he did. He came through. I called him in Japan to make sure he was a real person and all that. He seemed legit, so I went with it. I got a PlayStation and memory card, an extra controller, a Toshinden Ridge Racer, Killik the Blood, and Cyber Sled. And I was happy with that. I was set for that for a while, and then later I got Tekken and pretty much never played any of those other games again and stuck with Tekken for a very long time.
So 1997 rolls around and I've got like my first real job out of college. And I had like, before that I hadn't had a lot of money, and whatever money I had in college was like for beer and women. And I didn't pay for the women, but I did pay for beer. Just like every other like PlayStation owner who only bought a PlayStation for Madden, that was me in '97. I just picked up a PlayStation and picked up Madden, and that was that. That was the beginning. Sort of my re-entry into gaming.
First new PlayStation I bought about a month after the system came out, and then a few months after that I was buying my next PlayStation because the first one didn't last.
So I was playing Final Fantasy VII. During a couple of the FMV sequences, my PlayStation kind of stuttered. The game froze. Basically, almost the entire rest of the time I played Final Fantasy VII, I flipped my PlayStation over and played it upside down. It was probably just a bad burn of a batch of Final Fantasy VIIs, but I believed I was helping by having my PlayStation play upside down, so that's the way I kept it.
If you had one of those probably millions of PlayStations from the first production run that overheated all the time, you probably remember the conventional wisdom was flip the PlayStation over and the heat would dissipate out the vents. We didn't have the internet where I lived in 1995, so I didn't know about conventional wisdom. So my solution was to prop the disc tray open with a paper clip and point a house fan at the system, which was not nearly as effective as flipping it over, which I found out in subsequent years.
I don't know what everyone's problem is. You know, everyone's like, oh, I went through 9 PlayStations. Oh, I had to buy 3. My PlayStation broke like 2 weeks later and I had to have it upside down. My PlayStation that I bought with all those Genesis games still works.
Still pissed off. 10 years later, I'm still pissed.
When Sony launched the Sony PlayStation in 1994/1995, they made a pretty decent piece of hardware. Inside the machine, they actually included an LSI processor that went 33 megahertz. It was a 32-bit RISC chip that did 3D processing, which was pretty much unheard of anywhere on the computer, whatever, unless you're getting some really crazy machine. But for about $300 in comparison to most PCs back in those days that ran about $2,000 for a high-end machine, you got a whole lot of hardware for very little money. With the Sony PlayStation came the CD. I mean, other consoles had tried this before, but they were all secondary add-ons. You could count the 3DO, but I really wouldn't. But basically with the CD, you had a whole slew of advances. You could put on full motion video. You had about 650 meg worth of storage. You had fantastic audio. There was nothing to hate about it, except for a slight load time. That's about it. When the PlayStation first came out, its controller design was okay, but then Sony came out with the DualShock. And this thing is pretty much immortalized now. It's been on the PlayStation, it's on the PlayStation 2. The PC guys have been copying it for years now. And it's only now that the PlayStation 3 is coming out with the Batarang that this thing's actually going to go away. Although the PlayStation doesn't look like much, if we look at the internals, it's really astounding what Sony did with it. In the space of half the size of a VCR, we have one of the most powerful computers around at the time. Over here, we see the CD-ROM. If we flip up the front, we have the memory ports and the controller ports. On the back side, we got a parallel port, the audio ports, the video ports, and a power. The importance of Sony's PlayStation on the video game industry cannot be understated. First of all, Sony brought 3D gaming to the home. Second, the games themselves actually gained a whole new level of maturity. And lastly, everyone expected a whole lot more out of the games industry themselves. In terms of graphics, in terms of gameplay, and in terms of technology included, Sony raised the bar for everyone. Sony and the PlayStation is without a doubt one of the most important products and companies ever to come out in the gaming industry. If you look back at the history of it, Nintendo had actually asked Sony to design the PlayStation for it. At a later date, Nintendo then said no. Sony at which point decided they were going to launch their own console. The rest is pretty much history. The PlayStation, undeniable success. PlayStation 2, ridiculous success. And now the PlayStation 3. Who knows what's going to happen there?